So we're looking into the present reality, and there are some Bible beliefs which people disagree over, even though they're Christians. They agree the core message of the things I described about the miraculous birth of Christ and everything else, but they disagree over the things that you can see listed here. And I'm trying to tackle this in a fairly logical way. But the four different streams of Christian faith to do with the end times, I've tried to show in a different sort of colour scheme, starting at the top, which is meant to be green, and this is known as amillennialism. And that A means that it gives the impression of being without something, but it's actually trying to say that we are already living in the millennial period, which is the reign of Christ. It might not be fully realised yet, but our prayers are making a difference here on earth. That sums it up pretty well. And then there's another stream which is more modern, and that's the stream to do with post-millennialism, which, if you can see the illustrations, postulates that the second coming of Christ will be after the millennium itself. And another brand is to do with the premillennialism, and they too have got, well, quite controversial beliefs about the end times. A belief from the American Protestants, and these are some of the people who I think you could say are funding wars around the world because they're trying to bring on the end of time. And I find that quite a difficult concept for the Last Judgment. Is anybody still with me? Yeah. Oh, good. Well, let's just go quickly through each of these. So, starting with amillennialism. And this is the whole idea of the millennium comes from Revelation 20, chapter 20, where the writer, John, says that they came to life and reigned with Christ for 1,000 years. So this is one of the big hopes for the future, that when Christ reigns on the earth, there will be an end to war and hatred and corruption. It'll be like, literally heaven on earth. And as I say, most of the mainstream denominations, the Anglicans, the Catholics, the Orthodox, hold to this position. And what happened was there's a great theologian, St. Augustine of Hippo, and he wrote a book about the end times called The City of God. And in this book, he tried to make a defence for the Christian faith, which had been caught up in the destruction of the Roman Empire. Because when the Visigoths, I'll have to look into this from memory, the Visigoths came down and basically sacked Rome, and the Roman Empire fell, and people who survived said, well, that's because we were following Jesus Christ. We got it wrong. He's let us down badly, that kind of thing. So St. Augustine, who was living on Algeria or somewhere in North Africa, he wrote a defence of the Christian faith, and this is how the amillennialism came into being. But the way that people of that persuasion read the Bible is in terms of what we call the Wesleyan quadrilateral, where you have the Holy Bible as the ultimate authority, but you also take account of tradition. What is there in the Bible that helps, or we can learn from a traditional point of view? What is there that's there from a reason or science? And then what about our own personal experience? And they recognise these three influences in how we understand the Bible. So I gave an example earlier, I think, where Nicodemus, one of the Jewish leaders, came to Jesus at night and wanted to learn about the faith. And Jesus, to enter the kingdom of God, you must be born again. And Nicodemus said, well, how can I get back into my mother's womb? And Jesus was speaking figuratively there, and not literally. And that's the sort of thing which a scholarly interpretation of the Bible helps you to understand. So one of the most difficult books in the Bible, I think from anybody's point of view, is Revelation. And those of us who are from the mainstream denominations tend to avoid Revelation. It's too difficult. That's the attitude. I mean, there are some people who think it's very simple, but generally we have a question mark over Revelation. Just to give you a bit more of a context, the book of Revelation was written by, it was a revelation from Jesus Christ, which was given to John, and it's not the same John, at least the scholars think it's not the same John who wrote the Gospel or who was a disciple of Jesus. It's a different John. And the conclusion that the people from the amillennial view come to is that the book of Revelation is not a mysterious timetable of what is going to happen thousands of years on. It must be interpreted against the background of its own time. And at that time, the Christians were being persecuted severely. And John's revelation is written in coded language to help the Christians come through all that persecution. If he'd written it in a straightforward language, then it was found by the authorities in the possession of Christians, they would have been in trouble. But for example, in the book of Revelation, it refers to Babylon, when really what that is code for Rome. And so I've been looking at it through a couple of study guides by somebody called William Barclay, who's quite a genuine theologian. And if you're going to look into this for yourself, I would recommend having a reliable guidebook to help you. But the millennium itself is a bit like, I said earlier, it was at the time of like heaven coming to earth. And if you think of the story of the gospel in the way of God kind of going through a courtship with the people in Israel, drawing them to himself, and then coming in person with Jesus, and then really being engaged with like a bride and a groom would be. But then when he comes back in the future for the second coming or the rapture, and there's differences of opinion about that, it'll be like the consummation of the relationship. There will be, and the church is often described as the bride of Christ. Are you following me? So this is going to be a time of great celebration, as I say, 1,000 years. And I wonder myself whether that is a symbolic period of time, a perfect period of time, without having to be literally 1,000 years. So to try and give you an atmosphere of what this is the mood of this sort of belief, I'm just going to quickly flick. We'll have 10 seconds if I can find it of this music. Right. Hope this works. Something a bit Celtic about that, but you get the atmosphere, it's upbeat, and that's the sort of music you have around Christmas time. And some of the hymns for Christmas also apply, looking forward to Jesus' return. I hope I'm not boring you too much. Moving on then to post-millennialism, and this is a belief really in a more literal interpretation of the scriptures. I think I've just got one song here that summarises their view of what's happening in the world now until Jesus returns. Here we go. Can only get better. Well, the idea that's from the Labour Party's 1997 election campaign, just as an example of the mood of post-millennials. And then we come on to the pre-millennials that I mentioned earlier, and these are often the sort of evangelical wing of the church, particularly strong in the Bible Belt, where I have relatives in America. They have a more literal interpretation of the Bible, and they say if it makes common sense, then that's all you need to know. Whereas other more traditional groups would argue with that. And I think I've given that illustration already about Nicodemus coming to Jesus. Again, this is something you might want to research, but because it's quite a big movement across America and in Europe. But I once went on a 12-week Zoom course run by this guy, Simon Bennett, and he has got a lot of videos on YouTube if anybody would like to learn more about it. He draws some interesting statistics from the time period between Jesus' arrival and what was prophesied. But you know, I haven't really got my head around this, I must confess. But yeah, if you've got the time and patience, I would recommend reading up one of Simon's books or going on his course. He runs it from South Africa, by the way, and he's what's the word for it? Awake. So I think you'd find him quite a good guy. Here's one of the songs that comes with this movement, and they very much believe that there will be a rapture and the believers will be caught up in the air with Christ, and then they will stay with him in heaven. So this is what you might, but this is rather a sad song because it's talking about those who are left behind. You get it, two men walking up a hill, one disappears, the other left standing still. Yeah, there's been a film, it's got the Left Behind and books, the Left Behind series. One or two are nodding, so you may have come across that. And then we come finally to dispensationalism, which is everything that premillennials believe, with some exceptions. For example, this is a book about dispensationalism, and it goes back. It was invented really by a well-meaning Jew, at least I think he was well-meaning, in about 1870, and from their philosophy on life, they came to believe that there were 7 chunks of time which God had ordained, and they were leading up to Jesus' return and the millennium. Now, unfortunately, some of this teaching has come about because of their own version of the Bible that they published in about the 1880s. And there are things in there which the other denominations wouldn't agree with. One of them in particular being, I'll skip over that, a focus on Israel. So they have the Nicene Creed, but they've added to it an extra few paragraphs which they think are important and should have been there right from the beginning.
Reformation from?
Well, they looked at the Bible and they said, oh, that's been neglected, we need to emphasise that. I mean, for hundreds of years, there was only one source of authority, really, and that was, well, there was the Roman Catholic Church, and then there was something called the Great Schism in the 11th century, where the Orthodox went off as well on their own. And then there was the Reformation in the 1550s, and the Protestants went off from the Catholics. And ever since then, the church has been splitting. And does anyone want to guess how many Protestant denominations there are today? 30,000. I mean, there's the Church of the Sacred Tablecloth, and there's the Church of, you name it. They've always got reasons for falling out with one another and interpreting the Bible in their own way. And this particular group, which is there's four main streams of thought about the end times within the Christian faith, but this group believe that Israel will be restored to her own land in unbelief and will afterwards be converted as she repents, recognises and receives Christ as Messiah. That's one of their really important beliefs. And this is why there's a lot of funding from evangelical Christians in America coming into Israel. Going back to your point. And so, we do need to look at this a bit more carefully, but we haven't going to have a lot of time tonight. I'll just play a little bit of this. The church is one foundation. I don't know if you know this one. So, there we go. I'm having to rush through this a bit. Right, present reality and spiritual battle. And surely we all recognise some truth in this over these past few years. So I'm not going to spend too long on Satan, but enough to give you a flavour of what it's like. And I've already said earlier from the scriptures that our battle, according to St. Paul, is not against flesh and blood, but against rulers, against authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. And I expect, having, by the grace of God, spoken fairly boldly tonight about these things, I and my family will experience something of a backlash, because the enemy doesn't like these things to be out in the open. But I'm not too worried about that, as I'll say in a minute. If you like, one of the key Bible verses that Jesus gave us was in John's Gospel, when he was talking about himself as the Good Shepherd. And he said there, the thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. Well, you can guess who the thief is, can't you? It's Satan. But he says, I have come that they, that's you and me, can have life and have it to the full. I am the Good Shepherd. The Good Shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. So there's a divide, isn't there? Are you going to be misled by the thief, or are you going to go with the Good Shepherd? And another way he puts it is that we are to enter through the narrow gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. But small is the gate and narrow the road that leads to life, and only a few find it. So I think that says something about the culture we're in, which is increasingly brainwashing us to go down the wrong route. A bit more about Satan's activity. This is a little church I used to look after in the Cotswolds, and one day somebody noticed there was graffiti inside the porch, and it turned out that these were the same sort of graffiti that you get at Creswell Crags. Has anybody been over to there? And there's these little circular things are there to for protection by white witches have put them there, because they think that the demons will get into a tiz by going round and round inside that circle, and they won't be able to get inside the building. Seems a bit far-fetched to me. But anyway, that's the sort of thing you could still find around here. But I don't think we should get too fascinated with Satan, because this is his ambition. He doesn't like you or me. And if he could do that to each one of us tonight, I'm sure he'd get great pleasure out of it. And I take comfort from these words. I don't know exactly where they came from, but Satan trembles when he sees the weakest saint on his knees, because we're addressing Jesus Christ, who sits at the right hand of the Father in heaven. And Jesus has authority over Satan and his agents. So that's a comfort. And there are many accounts of people involved with the occult and witchcraft who receive the gospel in a way that is supernatural to them, and they come to freedom in Christ. And this lady, Doreen Irving, is quite well known in the 70s, and she wrote a book which is still quite a bestseller today. False prophets is the next thing in our summary of present reality. There's some examples down the left-hand side here of various movements that have come about by false prophets. And this guy over here on the right looks a bit like Jesus, or you might be easily misled to think so, but he's a Russian actually, and he's been done up for some kind of fraud, according to the great source of truth, The Guardian. But all down the centuries, there's been these sort of false prophets, and there's a whole list of them here. This is why the early church and the bishops had to meet together in Nicaea to agree what is the truth about Jesus. What do we believe? How is he different? So, for example, the Muslims and others who take their inspiration to some extent from the Jews and from the writings in the scriptures. But the one that I was just going to mention here is that one at the bottom called Pelagianism, and it holds that the fall did not taint human nature, and that humans, by divine grace, have free will to achieve human perfection, which is a bit similar to what you were saying, that Christ is already in us, and we can do it with his help, without necessarily having to admit that we're sinners, effectively. And that's when the Romans brought Christianity to England. This is the problem that they ran into. What they would regard as a heresy. We all alike have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. It's said, in different ways over and over again in the Bible. So confession and repentance is a key step to coming to saving faith. I better move on, and we can come back to that later. Then another medieval, this is several centuries later, medieval heresies. There was a group known as the Lollards. And now the Lollards are interesting, I think, for Derbyshire, because I don't know if anybody's been over to the Roaches. There's something called Lud's Cave. Has everybody seen it? Yeah. Well, apparently the Lollards used to meet there, and they were followers of John Wycliffe, who was a Bible translator, and they advocated that translating the Bible into English was, a good thing to do, but there's no need to be baptised, no need to confess anything, and they rejected the doctrine of transubstantiation, which is a Roman Catholic practice. So I would say the Lollards aren't entirely wrong, but they're far enough wrong that they weren't accepted as a mainstream denomination. That's Lud's Church. Margaret and I were there just a couple of weeks ago. Well worth a visit if you're over in the Roaches area. And then here's some more recent heresies. And this one, the Ranters, this one's relevant to Derbyshire as well. They held that the apocalypse, that's the complete and final destruction of the world, had already arrived. Anyway, the context was that from their point of view, the world had practically ended with the execution of Charles I. This was a disaster. Imagine our Charles III being beheaded. Some people, no, don't imagine it. Don't imagine it now, please. But anyway, it was for those who thought that kings were divinely appointed, this was like, you know, Oliver Cromwell would have been seen like a Satan figure, you know. Anyway, so the ranters felt that everything's fallen apart. You know, let's basically eat, drink and be merry, for tomorrow we die, that kind of thought. And they were coming at it from a very a totalitarian form of Puritanism. And they went to challenge that kind of authoritarianism that was really not of Christ either, but in doing so they fell into an even worse state of affairs. And this is, as I say, near Ireland, in Dovedale, up on the hill there's a farm, and in the farm there's some ruins, which is where the ranters used to meet until they fell out with one another, and yeah, that was it. And I've got one or two more modern heresies. Anybody come across ancient aliens? I have, yeah. I haven't met one yet, but it's the belief that extraterrestrial beings have brought advanced technologies to the Earth. And Eric von Daniken in the 60s and 70s wrote a series of books. And those of you who were here about a year ago may remember I told the story of my experience of going on an expedition to check out one of Eric von Daniken's ancient alien sites in Ecuador. And that was the trip when Neil Armstrong, and I know that's a whole separate discussion, he was the president of that expedition. There was a natural explanation for the phenomena that von Daniken had drawn attention to. It was in an earthquake zone, flat roof, sharp corners, and there was no library of gold plates, as he'd said, were down there. Of course, afterwards he said, well, he went to the wrong place, but we didn't, because we had it pinpointed from other people who'd been there. So it was yeah, I remain sceptical about the ancient aliens theory, and even when Neil Armstrong went to visit the Holy Land, he was in Jerusalem, and it's quoted in this leaflet that he was blown away by the thought that he was walking in the footsteps of Jesus Christ from where he was arrested in Gethsemane and taken up the hill to be interrogated by the authorities. So I think Neil Armstrong himself, whatever you think of him, he had some residue of Christian faith and respect. And then there's an even more recent category of heretics or heretical beliefs, and that's eugenics is an example I've picked on here. If you've come across eugenics, it's the pseudoscience of being a master race, and that you can destroy some people, for example the Jewish people, because they don't fit the criteria of the sort of people that those in control wanted to have around. So it's the scientifically inaccurate theory that humans can be improved through selective breeding of populations. And here's the character who's most famous for having swallowed this one and promoted it. Resulted in the death of 6 million Jews and another 6 million gypsies, trade unionists, Slavs, homosexuals, and a couple of other groups of people. I'm going to finish this off with talking about new religious movements. The more modern examples would be the Latter-day Saints, Jehovah's Witnesses, Rastafarians, Unification Church, Spiritual Church, Order of the Solar Temple. And a friend of mine called Nigel Scotland has produced a very interesting and helpful pocket guide to all these groups, which I can thoroughly recommend. Oh, I've got one more. Scientism. The belief that science and this scientific method are the best or only way to render truth about the world and reality. So I keep meeting, some of my best friends believe this sort of thing. You know, they think, how can somebody like myself, who they regard as reasonably intelligent and well educated, believe in myths and legends going back 2,000 or 3,000 years? And you know, but the sort of argument that I have to come up with is, you know, so are you saying then, because I would believe in things like truth, which is beyond the grasp of science. For example, the truth that I love my wife. And that cannot probably be proved scientifically. But the scientism would say, well, that is just a chemical reaction. In your body, it's producing hormones that make you happy. You see? And if you take the scientism to the extremes, that's the sort of ridiculous situation you end up in. I'm talking about modern heresies. There's another one. This book has latched onto some of the truth. It's by Hal Lindsey, and there's a film out there which I wouldn't recommend about late great planet Earth, and it's partly correct and partly wrong. You know, well, I can't really go into it very much, but it picks up on this idea that that there's going to be a third temple built in Jerusalem, and yet they missed the point really of what Jesus was saying in John chapter 2, where Jesus says, "Destroy this temple." He's talking about the physical temple, "and I will raise it up again in 3 days." Well, those of us in the know realise he was talking about his own body, that he'd be, if they were to crucify him, he would rise again 3 days later. But Hal Lindsey and others promote the idea that a third temple can be built in Jerusalem, and that animal sacrifices can be carried out there. Personally, I think they've got it badly wrong, you know. But there is something called the Temple Institute, which exists, and they're working away behind the scenes with funding from America to rebuild the temple. I don't know how they're going to clear the Temple Mount, where there's where there's a mosque, and it's difficult. I recently came across another website that was promoting the idea that Donald Trump was some kind of saviour, that he spends a lot of his time praying, and well, I don't doubt that he prays, but I looked into it in a bit more detail, and there's about 6 or 8 different Donald Trump Twitter accounts. And this picture of Donald J. Trump kneeling in front of Christ, which this particular guy promotes, is nowhere near the real Donald Trump. And so I'm sure you already know, don't you, how careful we have to be with these sort of messages. Sometimes the things that seem, oh, right on, it's just lies, but they're just appealing to our desire for verification. And then I'd just like to mention Vernon Coleman, who has got some genuine insights, I think, about Agenda 21. Everybody's heard of Agenda 21. And he foresees in this book, Endgame, that the powers that be are going to try and fuse together Judaism, Islam, and Christianity to make a new religion called Chrislam.
Well, at this point, I became somewhat distracted by questions and ran out of time, so the rest of this talk has had to be recorded back at home. As you can see, Vernon Coleman's book sits alongside a street poster promoting Islam, which is becoming much more prominent in Europe. Chrislam first came to my attention about 20 years ago when Pastor David Wilkerson from New York was visiting the UK. He said that in years to come, Christians in the European Union would come under pressure to take the Muslim view that Jesus was merely a prophet instead of being the Son of God. Also, that we would be required to renounce belief in his death and glorious resurrection. I can't help wondering if the Muslim religion has always had an element of compulsion about it, or is this a new phenomenon? Moving on to this new book about Elon Musk, who describes himself as a rule-breaking visionary who helped to lead the world into the era of electric vehicles, private space exploration, and artificial intelligence. Also took over Twitter. Clearly, Elon Musk is an exceptionally gifted person, and this image suggests he is prayerful. He's known to be a cultural Christian and a big believer in the principles of Christianity. However, as one of the richest people in the world, and now with political power in Donald Trump's administration, he will be exposed to new and serious temptations. We shall see. So now we come on to the persecution which Jesus experienced personally and warned about in the time after his ascension to heaven. Here in the Colosseum, we see a shocking depiction of husbands, fathers, mothers, daughters, innocent women, and even children being torn apart by lions in an immoral form of entertainment. Through faith in Christ, we trust that they rest in peace and will rise in glory. Persecution can take many other forms. For example, here the artist imagines the COVID mandates were being enforced at the Last Supper. It's obviously a spoof, but serves as a reminder of how easily and suddenly a democratic society can be gripped by fear and turn into a totalitarian regime. Another example is the legal ban on prayers in close proximity to abortion clinics. In Birmingham, this lady was simply standing and praying quietly, but she was arrested and fined, although subsequently was awarded £13,000 in compensation. This serves as a reminder of Orwell's book 1984, where the thought police are enforcing a totalitarian regime. I expect many of us are concerned for minority groups in Syria now that Assad has fled and ISIS or a similar regime are in power. But here we have an example from the Democratic Republic of Congo in Africa, where 80 Christians were recently murdered in the most brutal way. Of the 2 billion Christians in the world, some 380 million, that's 15%, are facing high levels of persecution for their faith, and every 9 minutes another Christian is being martyred. Jesus himself suffered persecution from the Pharisees, and his warning to those first disciples is still being fulfilled. Some would say that we are currently living through the last days of the last days before Jesus returns. Finally, in this section, we come to another prophecy which is currently being realized. Jesus commissioned his disciples to preach the gospel to every tribe and nation, but he also warned that many Christians would abandon their faith. This is known as apostasy. During the Victorian era, Christian missionaries took the faith throughout the Commonwealth, but since then, Christian worship has been in gradual decline, especially in the aftermath of 2 world wars. Over the past 25 years, worship on Sundays in the Church of England has been declining, as you can see from this graph. The Archbishop of Canterbury's decision in March 2020 to lock up parish churches was, in retrospect, a big mistake. Sunday worship has picked up a bit since then, but is still 20% down on before the COVID era. During the 10 years when Justin Welby was the Archbishop of Canterbury, the Church of England tried hard to reverse the decline by engaging with modern culture, although sadly with only limited success. For example, these headlines from 18 months ago: "Skip worship and pray for the lionesses, says Church." Although Bishop Libby subsequently clarified her statement, according to Premier Christian News. In summary then, the present reality is that Christians are constantly having to contend for the truth and the freedoms which many people in today's culture have taken for granted. We are definitely in a spiritual battle.